And I should say there's no conflicts related to this talk. So research and clinical work are symbiotic. Why research matters to clinicians and why clinicians matter to researchers. I want to start off with some jargon issues. These terms, when I was a resident, I didn't really quite understand them. A researcher or a medical scientist, a clinician scientist, non-academic versus academic. These terms have a lot of political influence, and it's important that you actually do understand them. And it's becoming a bigger issue today as medical schools are really beginning to de-emphasize the science curriculum. So when I grew up in my institution, there was the concept of the clinician, this town gown. Like if you were the town, you were the clinician, the strong clinician. The gown, you were the professor, and non-clinician. So clinicians were considered with strong clinical skills, great diagnosticians, but knew little science. So something like, what fits your busy schedule better, exercising an hour a day or being dead 24 hours? But not a lot of science content. The clinician scientists were thought to have great scientific knowledge, but better not leave them alone with patients. Here's the Center for the Study of Phenomena that have scientists scratching their heads. So the idea was, if you were a scientist, researcher, you didn't know how to take care of patients, and if you were a clinician, you didn't know how to do anything academic. I must say one of the things that attracted me to my job at McGill University was there was a really good mix between these two. There wasn't that separation in concept. So the clinical scientist brings a critical eye to the bedside. And in fact, in most of the 20th century, there was not much distinction between clinicians and clinical scientists. You go back to people like Osler, or in Canada, where I come from, in Toronto, Banting and Best with the discovery of insulin. Banting was a surgeon working away and with Best on these experiments. The one that brings to my mind in particular is this one. So when I grew up as a child, the Cystic Fibrosis Society used to have this campaign to buy these mist tents. None of you have ever seen them, and none of you ever know about them. But when I was growing up, my biggest fear in life was, would I end up in one of these tents and have to be treated? It just scared the daylights out of me. But they had this big campaign to have these. And then the question came up, do they actually work? But was it even ethical to test this in cystic fibrosis? Because they all know it works. It was the poster. They would go out collecting money based on these. And then this paper came out in 1972 in Pediatrics. And in this example, the physicians understood the physics of gases, and they realized that the carbon dioxide is heavier than oxygen, so it would settle to the bottom of the tent, displace oxygen, and potentially could make children worse. But the fear was, you can't test that. It's too dangerous. Well, they finally did it, and here's the graph which shows flow versus percent of vital capacity. They should be down here and better, but in fact, all the points were above the line, or majority of them. So in fact, the tents did make people worse, not better. The points should have been down here. So these were clinicians evaluating the science and had the understanding to go ahead and do that. And so you never see these tents now. Now, in cognitive science, so I actually worked with this woman, Vimla Patel, doing a lot of work on clinical reasoning, and especially medical reasoning. And one of the things that comes out of her work is you have two domains in your head. You have a basic science domain, and you have a clinical domain. So even though we talk about that town gown, it actually exists in your brain as two different parts. So just simplistically, these aren't where they are necessarily, but you have these two processing parts. Now, domains are collections of facts and experiences, and they allow you to think through things much faster. And there's different levels of knowledge in these domains. So coming from a cardiovascular background, the first level are simple definitions. So for the heart, cardiac output is heart rate times stroke volume. Preload is, afterload is. Simple definitions. That's level one. Level two takes those preload, afterload, contractility concepts and says, for example, what are the determinants of cardiac function? Preload, afterload, contractility, and heart rate. So you've taken those initial definitions, put them together for that next stage. But it's the third one, which is the really crucial one. And that's the complex concepts. It now says, if there's a pulmonary embolism, how will that affect cardiac output, which is based on all these other definitions. So you have this hierarchical knowledge. And the way to think of it is these are clumps. If you were programming a computer, these would be packages that you'd put into the program that are already preset. So to really get to that upper level, it requires building up experience in the domain of the expertise. So that's true for clinical medicine, but also for research activity. You have to build these up. And a classic example is that of the expert chess player who requires something like 1,000 hours, they estimate, to get to that level where you can read 10 levels, moves ahead, or even more for the masters. Okay, so that's a basic part of reasoning, any type of expert reasoning. And when you finish your training, legally, you are considered experts in court because you've mastered those levels of thought process. So the other thing that comes up in the way we think is what's called adductive reasoning. Adductive reasoning. So it's a form of logical reasoning that goes from observations to theory, which accounts for the observation, ideally seeking to find the simplest and most likely explanation. So the inference to best conclusion. And it's different than deductive reasoning. So unlike inductive reasoning, the premise does not guarantee conclusions. It requires building up experience. So for example, the grass is wet. Your most likely thought is, it rained last night. That would be your experience. On the other hand, it could be true that the sprinkler was on. That's possible. But your initial one would be going with that. That's the most common thing. You'd look up at the sky. It was dark last night. Everything makes sense, rather than looking at the sprinkler. But it could be both. So it's a rapid way of thinking, and clinically we do all this time. Retrosternal crushing chest pain radiating down your left arm, bang, you think of ischemic heart disease. You don't go through, oh, let me see, step by step. No, bang. And then you begin to question it after. But adductive is a very fast way of thinking, but it really requires developing expertise. And what's important to be able to go forward and backwards. So once you have that thought process, retrosternal crushing chest pain radiating down the left arm, as shown here, brought on by exertion, but it goes straight through to the back. And all of you are advanced enough to, stop, could this be a dissection? Or worse, with deep breaths. Oh, maybe pericarditis. So when you're doing that, you're going backwards. You have that first adductive, bang, out it comes, and then you go back. So in any rich domain, whether it's clinical or science, that's a part of the thinking process as an expert. And to get there, it comes with experience, both in clinical medicine and in research. So clinically, you would have seen that patient with the retrosternal crushing chest pain as a novice, and then, whoa, this one went through to the back, it was a dissection. You start thinking differently because you've had that experience. So it works both ways. So, as I said, the domain in science and clinical are separate parts of your brain, but they can learn to talk to each other and go back and forth. Thus, our science and clinical parts, as I said, can talk to each other. So let's come back to the science side. So this is Karl Popper, who rejected the classical view on inductive reasoning, A implies B, implies C, implies D, and favored a scientific method of empiric falsification. So a theory in the empiric sciences can never be proven, he concluded, but can be found to be wrong, can be falsified. And so he thought that science can be described as the art of systematic oversimplification. When a theory appears to you as the only possible one, take this as a sign that you have never understood the theory nor the problem which it was intended to solve. I remember as a trainee, there was a very elegant thinking person at my institution. Whenever at grand rounds, he would stand up and ask a question, go, I don't quite understand what you were saying, and you think, oh, well, he just didn't get it. And then, boom, came the question where he understood it far better than the speaker and knew where it was wrong. So I think this should be the motto for all clinical scientists and actually for all clinicians. I think a really important part of medical reasoning is keep testing your clinical hypothesis. So medically, you come up with an idea, you think this is what's wrong with your patient, but does everything fit? Is the pressures fitting with it? Is a lab test fitting? Always, which parts are agreeing and which parts are not? So back to the question, do clinicians need medical science knowledge? frankly, most medical practice, I would argue, is at a brainstem level. I did this last time and he died, I won't do it again. I did this last time and he got better, I will do it again. And in reality, 95% of the time, that is how we think. We get experience, you know it, and it's too slow to work out the others. You really have to be thinking faster. Interestingly, even using the wrong scientific model can be a useful memory tool. In my area, cardiovascular function, looking at Starling's law and the cardiac function curve, we talk about a plateau, and in rigorous teaching, there is no downward part to a Starling curve. What ends up happening, if you give too much fluid or whatever, you depress the cardiac function curve, so you're moving down other curves. But it actually does look like a downward part of the curve, so if you thought that was happening, it still could be a useful tool, even though it's wrong from the physiology side. So the wrong model can actually help you remember things like, oh, if I overdo it, I'm going to depress the heart. Excuse me, for the wrong reason. It's kind of sad, but it's true. Now, so I said a lot of medical reasoning is done at a brainstem level. Hypothetical deductive reasoning is far too slow. Just your patient would be dead by the time you work it through. So we work through associations. So that's why you need experience, and that's why being on call and actually having the time working becomes very important. Probably, I guess, a political statement, probably a problem in the European rules of cutting back on time, because you're just going to lack the experience. But it's also true that experience is essential for scientific reasoning. And this is obtained by doing studies, reviewing studies, and following current advances. So this, too, requires time and work, the same way as your clinical knowledge base requires time and work. Very hard to get as you move on. If you don't have protected time and you can't keep that going, it's really hard to keep up. So the basic science in the ICU clinician. Although 95% of practice, as I said, is probably at a brainstem level, in the ICU, we are frequently exposed to the other 5%, where it really does help to be able to reason through something. And I guess that's why I love being in the ICU. You stand at the bedside and you go, I have no idea what's going on. I don't even know which consultant to call to help me because I don't know what system it is. This is a good case. So it gives you, the research side gives you a deeper understanding of how things work. It helps you understand the physiological limits. And think about it. Why does a football player or a hockey player work out in the gym? I mean, that's not their sport, because those are helping them with their overall game afterwards. So what type of research for the clinicians? It could be in vitro, whole organs, clinical investigations of all the different types, so many layers of research. But the crucial point for me, they all have a common structure for doing the background search, as you're going to be hearing, asking the right question, which is probably the most fundamental thing in my mind in a research program, choosing the subjects and analyzing results, all topics that you're going to be getting. But that, no matter what type of research you're doing, that's a common process. And learning that process, then you can tackle any subject, even if you don't know that subject, because you'll go after that. What was the question they asked? Did the methodology address that question? Were the subjects chosen right, whether it's the subjects are cells or whether they're people? So it gives insight into how the body works, teaches a quantitative component of what is possible. I think that's too often missing when you read papers. It's just like, is this a significant factor? And that comes back to the way you choose your database, your power analysis at the beginning, and ask a question that has enough meaning by being different from the background. So research training, during your training or post-training. So I think it is useful to have research training, doing some research during your training, because you learn how hard it is to obtain even garbage. You know, you read that paper at a journal review, and you go, this is a bunch of garbage. But you find out how hard it is to actually even collect garbage. So you become a little bit more sympathetic to what you read. On the other hand, you begin to learn how easy it is to take that garbage and convert it into a message, which is probably not really there. So you get to learn both sides. Teaches you how to check for errors in data collection, choosing appropriate statistical techniques, justifiable exclusion of subjects based on predefined criteria while maintaining intellectual honesty. And as you check your own thought process and make sure you are intellectually honest, you can think of the temptations of some of those other writers. Okay. But do not overstate results and only exclude people based on consistent and well-defined principles. So these are some of the sense when you have to do your own, you're going to be able to pick up better in somebody else's work. Move on. Anyways, in doing the project, the key point is this. It helps you evaluate the medical literature, which is a lifetime task for all of us. Things keep changing dramatically, even faster today than ever before, and you have to have a way to know what is happening and what is going on. So, research training versus, during your training versus post-training. So let's say you decide to spend some time in the lab, and you get to work. Well, prior laboratory experience enables one to see physiological insights. For example, in my own experience, working in animal studies and understanding the concept of transmural pressure at the bedside gave me a much better appreciation of the plateau of the cardiac function curve and how the heart-lung interaction. So having that animal lab experience really helped me in that process. So what about research for the practicing clinician? Well, it validates what we know. It maintains intellectual honesty. And my feeling is you don't have to run the study, but even taking part in it will really be helpful because you get to hear the discussions of the methodology, you get to understand the process, and that really will make you much better at interpreting other people's work. So you don't have to run your own, but even being part of it. And in my own unit, I consider this a moral obligation, is taking part in at least some research projects to give some insight into the process. Now, on the basic science side, I don't have it here, this really is becoming harder today because that is moving along at such a rapid rate. I used to have a wet lab, I don't anymore, and just in a few years, when you're not doing it, woof, the techniques just change so fast and very hard to keep up with. So, what else with this? One of the things about doing research, it validates what we know. You learn to know that there's no absolutes, nothing is permanent. Karl Marx said, all that's solid melts into the air. Nothing stays the same. So practice must always be reevaluated. It's just, for me, it's just dramatic seeing how so many things have changed in my own career. Tight sugar, activated protein C, anesthesia, ABCs. We don't think of the airway breathing circulation anymore. You get the tube out in a patient once they're stabilized. Heavy sedation, gone by the wayside. So just a lot of things that were, quote, standard because we do it that way, gone. I think the most dramatic one for me is the fast track in colon surgery. Feeding the person the night before, feeding them the same day, out of hospital in 3 days. I mean, that's dramatic compared to what was done just 10 years ago. So research experience can help you your analysis of new theories. A good example for me was the nitric oxide story. So I studied the nitric oxide system in pigs and not rats and mice. Now, I did that for a practical reason. I was a novice at cell biology and the chemical techniques, so I thought pigs had lots of tissue, much easier than rats, so I'd have lots of tissue, and I could really get the experience on getting the NOSes out of the animals. And I also thought the bigger animals would be closer physiology to the human. So that was sort of my naive thought process. But it turns out that pigs have very little iNOS, inducible nitric oxide synthase, and so do humans. And so, in fact, the pig is a much better model than a rat and mouse for comparing to humans. And based on our studies, we found very little iNOS in the pig, which is also the case in humans. And because of that, I never would have entered the iNOS trial, or the NOS inhibitor trials in the 90s, I just thought it would probably be bad because it would actually inhibit the NOS that's there, which was good NOS. And in fact, the study was stopped prematurely because it was harming people. So this animal experience, I just wouldn't touch that study because of that. Now, the other way you can look at it, sometimes it's better to have a lucky doctor than a smart one. One of the other areas of interest I've had in the past was reactive oxygen species. Did a number of studies and did a translational piece called superoxide, toxic molecule or spark of life. So in various studies, both in whole animals and cells, we've studied the role of oxygen radicals as a signaling molecule in endothelial cells. And one of the things that came out of this is that it works both ways. It can turn on cytokine processes that help you protect you in sepsis. It can also turn off certain processes. And it differs from different cell types and different cytokines. Cytokines, a very complex process. So my conclusion was modulate, but don't obliterate. And I wasn't surprised by the failure of repeated studies that tried to treat reperfusion injury and ARDS with antioxidants. Because of a deeper understanding of the process, it was just too simplistic to think that you could take a single tool and have a huge effect. And it gave me a much deeper insight into reactive oxygen species chemistry. So which is more important, research activity or just studying the physiological knowledge? Maybe, I don't have to do them. I'll just read those journals on a regular basis or go back to the books and study. Well, experimental experience helped me understand the limits of getting the information. What I mean by that is, when you read a paper, the original facts from that experiment really don't give you a story. They tell you that when this happens, something else happens, but they don't give you any clinical meaning out of that. That has to be extrapolated. So this requires an interpretation, which is helped by clinical experience. And so when you're reading textbook and articles, well, they're giving you an interpretation of data, and thus they're opinions. They're not the original data. A true critical approach requires going back to the original data, reviewing what was actually observed and how the data was obtained. And does it actually say what the reviewer is saying? And this is where experimental experience helps, because you can be more critical of their methods. It's really quite surprising when you go back to papers that some of the conclusions that we take as standard, then when you read the paper, that's just not in the paper. It's just not there. You also learn the limits of science. I like this line: physiology predicts nothing but explains everything. The first time I did this talk, I went back to try to find where this quote came from. I thought I got it from one of my mentors. I'm sure I got it from one of my mentors. So I went searching. I found a site on the web that actually had it. I went to the site. Oh, great. I can find out who the reference is. And they had a whole bunch of great references, went through it. And then who did they reference? They referenced me. This is the site, but frankly, it's not mine. So don't trust what you see on the internet. But I'll take credit for it now, I guess. Must be true, it's on the internet. So research career, it's not for everyone. You need to be a little crazy, major time commitment, and not funded like clinical work. You're exposed to constant criticism from granting agents, journal reviewers. Clinical management can provide a much more immediate gratification, at least when successful, but when not, at least going back to the lab can be a reprieve. However, for those who are crazy enough, it can be very stimulating. It helps burnout. It makes you feel much more intellectually credible, keeps you much more intellectually rigorous with a healthy mixture of skepticism, but also optimism, and develops national and international colleagues, which is why I'm here today. The reverse side of the story, clinical experience for the scientists. We asked this question to various experts, clinical and non-clinical. What happens when a clot blocks a pulmonary artery? A cardiologist with a strong background in math, physics, and physiology gave a great comprehensive answer. Another cardiologist with strong clinical skills, but not the science, gave an okay answer. But a PhD physiologist who taught the cardiovascular physiology course just collapsed because he didn't have the experience of what happened, and there was too many possibilities, and he gave up. So what we get as scientists, a clinical scientist, is constant feedback from the patient experience. For me, the ICU is a living laboratory. Humans are different from other animals, so our clinical experience tests the generalizability of hypotheses. There's cross-fertilization between the fields, for example, the relationship between cardiovascular and respiratory physiology. And the scientist at the bedside is key for that translational component of new scientific knowledge, and can act as a translator between the basic scientist and clinician. So clinician scientist needs to maintain a science experience as the clinician needs to maintain a clinical experience. With today's rapid advances in science and clinical knowledge, this is not easy to do. Now, I think where it's very important is in clinical trials. You really need to have clinicians involved in these, choosing endpoints, understanding inclusion and exclusion criteria. Are the conclusions true outside the study? The subtleties of the subject differences, For example, complications of colloids are well demonstrated for septic patients when given in large doses, but hasn't really been studied in perioperative patients. Is the experience in the trial the same as at the scientist's institution? The last point I want to make is, will the clinician scientists actually be able to survive as methodologies get more and more complex? And even on the epidemiology side, the statistical models and other parts are getting tougher and tougher to deal with. Well, there's a real concern about that, and other people have written on it. So just in conclusion, clinical research was at the core of activities of the early 20th century clinicians. The complexity of modern science as well as clinical medicine has separated these two domains so that it's really difficult to do both. The clinician scientist, I think, truly is an endangered species because of that. But the rewards to do both are diminished. It's harder for the clinician to get funding for basic and innovative ideas because they have trouble competing with a pure PhD. And it's difficult to compete with the full-time professional researchers. Yet the bedside clinician is an essential link in providing the validity to the system. So we must work to maintain a scientific basis for clinical practice, starting in medical school, and I think we really have to push to get more back into medical school and throughout professional development. And it's not about clinical practice, but about maintaining intellectual integrity. And the subtle reasoning that comes from scientific knowledge and the judgment that is based on this knowledge is what distinguishes us from machines that would replace us. Thank you.